What's up everyone, this is White Pointer, and in this video, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. What I'll be doing here is diving into some video game history to explain how a well-known event happened, that being the Great Video Game Crash of 1983. A lot of fingers are pointed at one specific game as the cause of this, that being E.T. the Extra Terrestrial on the Atari 2600. But is that really the case? Is it really fair to be blaming this one game on an industry-wide recession? The short answer is no, and here are the reasons why. It's pretty well documented at this point that between 1983 and 1985, the at the time thriving video game industry, headed by Atari, suffered a monumental collapse. E.T. the Extra Terrestrial for the Atari 2600 is often a title that is pointed at as the reason for the crash, and make no mistake, it was definitely an awful game. However, it's a little unfair to be lumping all of the blame on this one title. While it played its part and contributed, the number one reason was simply an oversaturation of the market. By 1983, there was simply too many video game systems available and not enough quality titles to go around. In 2019, we have three major players in the console market: Sony, Nintendo and Microsoft, each with one current major console each. But in 1983, hoo boy! There was the Atari 2600, Atari 5200, Intellivision, ColecoVision, CreatorVision, CassetteVision, AdventureVision, Microvision, Odyssey 2, Vectrex, Sega SG-1000, Aquarius, Fairchild Channel F, Astrocade, and that's not even all of them. Seriously, I'm not making this up. This was the video game landscape back then. Cast your mind back to around 2007-2008, when the rhythm game craze really hit its stride. There were countless Guitar Hero and Rock Band games released within only a few years, and consumers eventually had enough of it, resulting in no more rhythm games like those being made. Now imagine that, but on console hardware on a wider scale, and you might understand why having so many systems on the market was an issue. Secondly, this was compounded by the emerging market for personal computers. Systems such as the Commodore 64, Apple II, ZX Spectrum, Tandy Color Computer, BBC Micro and others were establishing themselves as multifunction devices, workstations that could also play games. Because they were competitively priced against dedicated video game consoles, consumers considered them a better long-term investment, and these also started eating into the home console market. Thirdly, Atari and others had no real process of quality control when it came to the games released on their systems. This led to a flood of poor quality titles hitting the market, and Atari themselves were guilty of this perhaps more than anyone else. It started with their abysmal 2600 port of Pac-Man. Pac-Man was the most popular arcade game at the time, so when Atari secured the license for it, they couldn't wait to get the game out. You could imagine that all the executives must have seen dollar signs in their eyes. Now, there's lots of rumours and speculation around what actually happened here, with various stories, such as Atari deciding to release a prototype rather than a finished game, or that the programmers didn't care about the quality because they were getting heavy royalties, or that the game was intentionally poorly made. We don't really know what's true and what's not, but the end result was not great. Everyone knows what Pac-Man looks like. It looks like this. Right? But the Atari 2600 port looked like this. Yeah, you can kinda understand why gamers were pissed off back then. Not only did they ship a poor quality product, but Atari also grossly overestimated how much it would sell. 12 million copies of Pac-Man were made, even though the install base of the Atari 2600 at the time was only about 10 million. Atari actually believed every single 2600 owner would want a copy, and an extra 2 million consoles would be purchased by people just to play the game. In the end, it sold about 7 million, which still made it the best-selling game ever on the Atari 2600, but left Atari with about 5 million unsold Pac-Man cartridges sitting around. For what it's worth, when the Atari 5200 was launched, it included a much more accurate version of Pac-Man, but it was too little, too late. Now this is where E.T. the Extra Terrestrial comes in. Atari had already shot themselves in the foot with Pac-Man, and this was the straw that broke the camel's back. The game was rushed and reportedly completed in just 6 weeks to make it in time for the holiday season. Once again though, because E.T. was such a hot property at the time, Atari overestimated how much the game would sell. 4 million copies of E.T. the Extra Terrestrial were shipped, and about 3.5 million of those were returned to Atari. Atari themselves had enough in the bank to survive the recession of the industry, despite the fact that they needed to bury reportedly millions of copies of E.T. the Extra Terrestrial in the landfill. This was considered a possible myth until an excavation in 2014 found more than 700,000 cartridges of various titles, including many copies of E.T. Many other smaller companies didn't survive though. The damage to Atari was done, however, and Atari never returned to its once dominant market position, despite several attempts to do so. They eventually bailed out of the hardware business altogether to become a third-party software developer in 1996, following the commercial failure of the Jaguar. It should be noted that the great video game crash of 1983 was pretty much restricted to consoles. The earlier mentioned computing systems at the time saw sales increase, if anything, as they were marketed as work systems that could also play games. The arcade scene also managed to survive relatively intact, but the home console market was in tatters. That is, until a little Japanese company quietly launched their Famicom console across the pond as the Nintendo Entertainment System towards the end of 1985. Interestingly, Nintendo had learned from Atari's mistakes too, and included a lockout chip in their console. This prevented third parties from just shoveling their products onto the system, as they needed to be approved by Nintendo themselves. This didn't stop a stack of bad games being released on the NES, of course, but it was still much more regulated than it previously had been. This also shifted the video game hardware industry from being based primarily in the US to being based primarily in Japan, which actually still remains mostly true today. So there you go, that's a quick history of the great video game crash of 1983. While the E.T. game did play a role, it's often seen as the scapegoat of the whole fiasco, when it really wasn't the case at all. There were a lot of factors that combined to cause the crash to happen, and E.T., while it's not a great game, and is sometimes referred to as the worst game of all time, is unfairly blamed for the whole thing. What do you think about this kind of content? Would you like to see more of it? Drop me some comments below and give me a thumbs up if you liked the video. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with my content. Thanks for watching!